Let's recap our top story. Donald Trump will make history shortly when he becomes the first former or sitting US president to be criminally charged. We know he's left Trump Tower and is now on his way to the court in New York. Exactly what the charges are and how many isn't yet clear, but we do know they're in connection with a payment made to buy the silence of an adult film star, Stormy Daniels, just before the 2016 presidential election. Mr. Trump has described the case as a political prosecution and has urged his supporters to protest. Well, law enforcement in New York is on a heightened state of alert amid fears of a repeat of the January the 6th scenes when Donald Trump supporters stormed Washington, D.C. New York Mayor Eric Adams warned protesters that any trouble would not be tolerated.
The message is clear and simple. Control yourselves. New York City is our home, not a playground for your misplaced anger. We are the safest large city in America because we respect the rule of law in New York City. And although we have no specific threats, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is known to spread misinformation and hate speech, she stated she's coming to town. While you're in town, be on your best behavior. As always, we will not allow violence or vandalism of any kind, and if one is caught participating in any act of violence, they will be arrested and held accountable, no matter who you are.
And that's the Mayor of New York there, Eric Adams. Well, for more analysis on the impending criminal indictment of Donald Trump, let's bring in Arise correspondents Karl Bostic and Laurie Laird, who are monitoring developments for us from London. Thank you very much indeed to both of you for joining us. Let me come to you first, Karl. A historic day for US politics and for Donald Trump, although perhaps not in the way that he would have wanted. Set the scene for us as he becomes the first US president serving or former to face criminal charges.
That's right, Charles. Yes. Never in American history has a sitting or former U.S. president ever been criminally indicted, ever. And Charles, that's what's about to happen today. Donald J. Trump is about to appear in a New York courtroom facing charges that could be as many as 34, for example, having to do with not just hush money payments, but payments that were made to protect his campaign, because this was during the final weeks of the campaign that saw him elected and defeating Hillary Clinton. That's what makes this a federal felony. The problem, Charles, is that this has never been tried before. It's a novel legal argument. It's difficult to say if this will, in the end, pass muster. And Charles, you also have to understand this. This is not the only legal trouble Donald Trump is facing. There are multiple investigations out there, which in many ways are much more not only compelling, but much more serious. You've got his role in the January 6th riot in Washington in 2021, where they're investigating his role in attempts to delay, if not overturn, the certification of Joe Biden's election. And perhaps most seriously, you've got an Atlanta prosecutor in Georgia looking at efforts by Donald J. Trump to find those votes to overturn the results in Georgia. In fact, saying on the phone, can you find me 11,000 votes? That's really more compelling. But again, Charles, going back to your question, what's important is this. For all these multiple investigations, this is the first. Some would even argue, Charles, that no one wanted to be the first to say that this is the investigation that will bring him to court, because this is history in the making before our eyes. And yet it's the least compelling case. And it's going to be a 15-minute appearance, Charles. He's going to appear in court. He's going to be booked, charged, fingerprinted, a mugshot taken. It's unclear if we'll see the mugshot made public at all, and then he'll leave. No video cameras in the court, a few still photos, yet He sees this actually as perhaps a campaign opportunity. And that's what has not only Republican rivals concerned, but also Democrats.
Karl, thank you very much indeed for setting that out. And we're looking at pictures there. Of Donald Trump, his motorcade. He's accompanied by his security detail heading to Lower Manhattan and that courtroom where he is expected to be arraigned. Arise U.S. correspondent Eric Ham is in Manhattan, just outside the court. We will be joining him there imminently when Mr. Trump arrives. But of course, Laurie Laird is with us, as is Karl Bostic. And let me come to you, Laurie. Of course, Mr. Trump's response to the charges against him has been typically defiant, hasn't it?
Yes, that's right, Charles. And we're looking at these pictures, and if my geography of New York is correct, he is not far from the courthouse right now. He has made his way to Lower Manhattan. And there we've heard from the Trump campaign or the Trump defense that he may address reporters as he walks into the building. So we're all anxiously awaiting that. And I think it looks like they have arrived. So we'll keep an eye out to see whether he does address the cameras outside the court. We know that there are not television cameras inside the court. But I'd like to go back to something that Karl was saying. And I think Karl really hit the crux of this case. This is, to my mind, the weakest case. It will be devilishly hard to prove. What we're looking at is whether these payments to Stormy Daniels, hush payments, are not illegal. What may be illegal, and we're assuming that this is what the indictment is. We have not seen this indictment, but we're assuming that this hush money payment to Stormy Daniels, not illegal, but what may be illegal is the way it was accounted for. And let's take that a step further. The prosecutor will be trying to prove that these hush money payments broke federal election law. Here's the problem. This is state court, and it's very difficult to mix and match federal offenses with state offenses. As Karl said, this is untried. We haven't seen it proved before, and I wouldn't be entirely surprised if this case were dismissed at some point. As Karl says, there's a lot more legal jeopardy going on, but this is the first one. But this, I think, is probably the most difficult case to prove.
Right, I'm not quite sure where that yell came from, but I expect it's from the live camera that's feeding us those pictures. But as you said, Laurie, we're looking at live pictures there of the arrival of former US President Donald Trump at that Lower Manhattan court. He will go in there now. I understand he'll be fingerprinted. His Miranda rights will be read to him, and it's not clear whether he's going to have his mug shots or not, and then he will be taken before the judge. But Karl Bostic, of course, still with us, and we can't quite see them in that live shot, Karl, because I understand this is a side road and is not the main entrance to that courtroom. But we know, or we've heard, that opponents and supporters of the former president are outside the courtroom in New York, and I understand that extra security measures are in place there to avoid any form of demonstration.
That's right, Charles. In fact, you played a clip of New York's Mayor Eric Adams basically admonishing, if not warning people to, quote, be on their best behavior while in New York. There was, really a worst case scenario in which people just do not want to see a repeat of what happened January 6th, when you had a mob storming the U.S. Capitol in Washington back in 2021 in January. However, today, Charles, in many ways, yes, there have been scuffles. Yes, there's been a lot of shouting, but it's heavily, heavily barricaded. Both pro-Trump and anti-Trump supporters have been kept far apart by barricades. In fact, one of Trump's most ardent supporters, the Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, she had a bullhorn. She tried to address the crowd of pro-Trump supporters. She was reportedly drowned out constantly because people were just blowing so many whistles. No one could hear it at all. So we're not seeing, shall we say, the outbreaks of violence we saw that transpired back in January 6th. In fact, one thing to keep in mind, Charles, is this. New York has really a 35,000 strong police force. That's more than many nations or countries in the world, Charles. But not only in terms of numbers, they're amongst the best trained. All of them have been on alert, Charles, to step in if their services were required. So that's the state of high alert we're talking about right now. And what's also interesting, Charles, is this. You talk about that side street that we saw him exiting the vehicle, that aerial shot. You know, what's interesting about this, you know, you've had these kinds of demonstrations before in places like, you know, Washington with January 6th, where we had the mob of many thousand, you know, marching down the streets and, you know, storming the Capitol. Don't forget, Charles, you had Charlottesville, Virginia, where you had, again, the neo-Nazi crowd, you know, marching down the streets and all this such. Basically, the police overwhelmed. As one security analyst put it, almost cynically, he says, well, when it comes to protesting in New York City, you know, with the pro-Trump people, the MAGA people, it's a little bit much more difficult. Because for the people who are really pro-Trump, they live very far away. It's difficult to get to New York City, especially Manhattan. Not only is it far away, you have to go through a lot of toll roads, it's expensive, and then as one person smugly put it, there's no place to park. So it's difficult for large numbers of people to mass near the courthouse. So that's what we saw today. You know, the former president, Donald Trump, going through a side door, the back entrance. He had mused about maybe going through a perp walk, you know, going through a flashing crowd of media and crowds. That did not happen, Charles. We did not see that. So that was really kind of tamped down by New York security officials.
Well, absolutely, and we're looking at live pictures there, aerial views of that Manhattan courthouse where Donald Trump is being imminently arraigned, criminally charged. Laurie Laird still with us, of course, and Laurie, you've got lots of contacts in America. Listening to ordinary Americans who oppose and support Mr. Trump, what is the summary of their positions? Because we seem to be hearing opponents saying that if in fact he's committed these crimes he's been indicted for, then justice has to be served because America is a rule of law country, whereas supporters say that if he goes to jail for such an absurd charge, what they see as an absurd charge, then the country is essentially over and the US is dead. I mean, one of them put it that way. So quite a lot of visceral reactions from what I gather.
And I think that it's very important to point out that Donald Trump will not find a whole lot of support in New York City. There are all the reasons that Karl mentioned. It is difficult to get to New York City if you're a Trump supporter, but he does not have a natural constituency in New York. He is not very well thought of, despite the fact he is a native son. And in fact, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was singled out by Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, she only stayed for 10 minutes. It felt like she, got enough photograph for her social media. She did her support, but she is not leading the charge against him anymore. This is not a place where Donald Trump will find support. But I think something that's really important is that Donald Trump and his team, one of their defenses is this is politically motivated. And I think we have to be very, very careful here. We cannot get into a place in this country where we talk about the rule of law being politically motivated, because the next person who may come to trial may not be a Republican. And I think that we're getting into a situation where perhaps prosecutors are not that keen to take on prosecutions because they're accused of being politically motivated. Let's go back to the January 6th hearings. We know that Joe Biden was slightly ambivalent about pursuing that. And I think we're getting into a very dangerous place where prosecutors may not take up cases because they may be accused of being politically motivated. And I think this is really quite frightening.
And I think that's a very, very good point you make there, Laurie. And let me come to you, Karl Bostic. I mean, we've changed the angle of the cameras. We're looking now at a medium shot with some people in close-up of that motorcade that brought Donald Trump to the Manhattan court. Security details all out there. He's obviously not there. He's gone into the courtroom. But setting the scene for that, Karl, I mean, we've seen this wall-to-wall coverage of the former president's journey from his resort in Florida to New York. We saw helicopters, TV cameras, drones following the takeoff of his Boeing 757 as it made its way to New York. And then, of course, as he drove in that motorcade, flanked by security, to his penthouse in Trump Tower, and then, of course, the one that we saw just a few minutes ago of him making his way to the courthouse. And that sets the scene, doesn't it, Karl, for where America finds itself, which is that never before has a president been charged with a crime like this.
You know something, Charles? Not only does it set the scene for America historically, never having a sitting or former president being charged with a crime, it's really, you could say, Charles, the unofficial beginning of the 2024 presidential campaign, because this will now be a dominant theme for as long as he remains a candidate for the Republican nomination. And it's going to be something that's part of his strategy, just to drag this out to, as some would say, he's going back into his playbook, because he's no stranger to legal disputes. He's got 4 decades of experience, except this is the highest profile. And he's going to, as they would say in sports references, he's going to try to run out the clock. And the reason why that's important or significant, Charles, is because for all those Republican rivals who just simply want to, see the back end of Donald Trump, if anything, he's now more popular than ever before. So it's not only setting the stage for American history, it's also really setting the stage for the 2024 election campaign. And that's what Republicans are really trying to wrestle with right now, because he remains not only as popular as ever, but perhaps even more popular because, again, going back to what you're saying, Charles, you even had Republicans being very careful about how they gave a very nuanced response to what's going on, Charles. They were saying on the talk shows over the weekend on Sunday, they were saying really a mixed message, Charles. No one is above the law, but no one should be the target of such an indictment for political purposes. So that's a mixed message. But then there's another person that said, you know something? If a crime has been committed, there's nothing partisan about that. So that's what's going to be happening right now. Because this delay strategy, that's now going to be an undercurrent, a dominant theme as he remains the Republican candidate. And that's going to color the campaign. And Democrats are also worried and nervous because just when no one took him seriously in 2016, he surprised everyone in the rest of the country. The difference is he now has a history, and people know who Donald Trump is.
Well, quite. And now that you've brought it up, Karl, let me get Laurie Laird's perspective on that. I mean, what does all this, Laurie, mean for Donald Trump's hopes of becoming the Republican Party's presidential nominee? How much of a political dimension or a political risk comes with this?
Make no mistake, this is a campaign move, and there's been some speculation that Donald Trump's team, even if a mugshot is not released, there's talk of mocking up a mugshot, putting it on T-shirts, and selling that to try and get sympathy from this Republican base that remains so devoted to Donald Trump. But I think one thing that is a very big question in my mind is whether the judge actually issues a gag order. A lot of speculation that there will be a gag order that will prevent Donald Trump and his legal team from talking about anything to do with this case. That will rob Donald Trump of a big campaign rhetoric for him. He is going to Mar-a-Lago tonight. He is going to do a very big speech. If there is a gag order, and there's no guarantee that there will be a gag order, but certainly we have seen gag orders in criminal trials before. If there is a gag order, it does slightly alter what we assume will be Donald Trump's campaign strategy, which is to point himself as a victim of a political witch hunt.
Well, that would be a very interesting development, one that we would have to watch very closely, because, I mean, if there is a gag order, as you said, it would certainly affect Mr. Trump's strategy. But gag order or not, Karl, it's interesting that, as you were pointing out, if you look at polls that have been taken since Mr. Trump was indicted, they show him rising in favorability with Republicans. So at this stage, he does appear to have a lead over other potential Republican primary candidates, so looks more likely to become his party's nominee today than he did 3 weeks ago.
Well, Charles, he's always been the leading candidate, no matter how you put it. It's Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis, who was seen as really, shall we say, a diet Trump or light Trump, because he's someone who is, in some cases, even further to the right than Donald Trump, but without all the personal baggage. And he was someone that even MAGA type Republicans liked a lot, and even moderate Republicans. However, he doesn't have the same national stature or profile of Donald Trump. And since this indictment last Thursday, Charles, what's really striking is, I mean, Donald Trump was always ahead in the polls, but Ron DeSantis was closing in. He now has a 26-point lead amongst Republican voters. It's a way of saying that people just don't care about this kind of indictment. And especially one thing to keep in mind is this, Charles. When you look at the other investigations coming out, two things to keep in mind. Really, there's a kind of a hesitancy or apprehension about which investigation would lead to charges first, because it's an historical first. So now we've kind of gone beyond that barrier. We've gone beyond that psychological barrier of the first former president ever in U.S. history being indicted. But there are much more serious ones in store. And then, Charles, this is not the first time a presidential candidate has been investigated for a sex scandal. If you want to look at recent American political history, you've got a Senator John Edwards back in 2011. He had a mistress, which is much more involved than this particular one, where he was making payments to his mistress, and there was an investigation involving these payments and possible campaign finance violations. In the end, there was no conviction, and he was acquitted on the rest of the multiple charges and all, but he did withdraw from the race. That's what happened with John Edwards. But the point I'm making is this, Charles. When it comes to sex scandals and investigations, people almost like look the other way. That's already kind of baked into who Donald Trump is. They know about his colorful past of having affairs and relationships and with mistresses and things like that. What's more serious about what has Donald Trump done to democracy in the U.S.? And that's what will come out in the Georgia investigation, his attempts to overturn results there and what happened on January 6th. And will voters be less forgiving when it comes to those investigations? That's why this is still, Charles, early days. But that's also why Donald Trump wants to drag this out for as long as possible, because as long as he drags it out and delays it, it plays to his favor advantageously in the playing field amongst other Republican rivals.
Yeah, those are very good points you make there. And Laurie, Laird, we talked about the polls that have been taken since Mr. Trump was indicted, showing him rising in favorability with Republicans. But other polls show independent voters who are not the party faithful being less impressed. I mean, how much of a problem is that? Because it seems to suggest that he may well be his party's nominee, but he'll have a very tough time at a general election.
Important point, because look, we have two elections in the U.S. There will be an election to choose the Republican candidate, and then there will be a general election. And I think it's notable that what is happening to Donald Trump is coming at a time that Ron DeSantis, who seemed to be in the ascendant for so long, he is the governor of Florida. He won Florida by such.
Okay, I apologize. I'm not quite sure what happened to Laurie Laird there, but she was yanked off our line. But I understand that Eric Ham is with us live from Manhattan in New York. I wonder if you can hear me, Eric, and if you can tell us what's going on the ground where you are. told that he can't hear me, but I understand that Karl Bostic is still with us. Karl, let me come to you then, whilst we're waiting to reconnect with Laurie Laird and connect with Eric Ham. I understand that Mr. Trump has had a phenomenal time fundraising, and that all this has been a big boost to him financially, and I heard someone saying that that's one of the arguments against the mug shots that you talked about earlier, that there is some concern that Mr. Trump could use it to his advantage to try and produce merchandise, for instance.
That's right, Charles. In fact, since that Thursday indictment, he's raised millions of dollars. In the first day alone, something close to $4 or $5 million, and then several $1 million afterwards from, again, small donors across the country. That's his base, Charles, and that's what we're seeing. This is really, in many ways, call it what you will, it's a gold mine for him, for his campaign financially. And as long as this goes on and continues, Charles, he's going to continue mining that. And that's what we're seeing play out right now. And the thing about it is, Charles, even though there are no cameras in the courtroom, there's going to be more of Donald Trump that we see in the coming days. You know, there are no cameras in the courtroom, but there are cameras in the hallway. Into the courtroom, he may make a statement there. And then even tonight, Charles, he's expected to be holding, if not a press conference, to make a statement once he returns to Mar-a-Lago later this evening. So this is something where he wants to really turn this to advantage, even though these are very serious charges. He faces a trial that could lead to conviction, and it could actually hasten, if not accelerate, other investigations moving forward as well. And that's what we have seen right now. But otherwise, as you rightly say, Charles, he's raking it in. And his closest rival, Ron DeSantis, has also, raised more than $100 million. So this is going to be a very, very expensive campaign, except no one would have thought that being charged, being indicted, facing possible conviction could actually lead to a boost in fundraising.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Karl, and please don't go anywhere, because we're going to be coming back to you shortly. Karl Bostic is our special correspondent, and of course Laurie Laird is also with us, as is Eric Ham, who is in Lower Manhattan, where Donald Trump is being indicted, or at least facing his criminal indictment in that courtroom. We'll return to all that shortly. Welcome back to Arise News Hour, a special extended edition. I'm Charles Anyegolu in Abuja. Let's recap our top story. Donald Trump is making history in New York, where he's become the first former or sitting U.S. president to be criminally charged. Following his arrival at that Manhattan courthouse, Mr. Trump is now formally under arrest and in police custody ahead of his upcoming arraignment. Exactly what the charges are and how many isn't yet clear, but we do know they're in connection with a payment made to buy the silence of an adult film star, Stormy Daniels, just before the 2016 presidential election. Mr. Trump has described the case as political prosecution and has urged supporters to protest. Well, let's make a valiant effort to cross live again to New York and speak to Arise US correspondent Eric Ham, who is outside the Lower Manhattan court building where Donald Trump is facing criminal charges. I'm hoping, Eric, that the line will be better this time than it was before. Anticipation, of course, mounting about what's going on in that courtroom in New York where you are. What's the atmosphere like there now?
Charles, if this is considered a circus, it certainly fits the bill. I mean, it is raucous. I mean, you're seeing throngs of people, a lot of makeshift dolls of Trump hanging. One guy is in a prison jumpsuit with a Donald Trump mask on. And when you asked about what was going on inside the courtroom, right here, right off to my right, this is where the print reporters who could actually go in and view the proceedings, they were actually lined up to go inside. So they all have gone inside. And so we expect that actual hearing is underway. Right now, you've got helicopters that are flying above us as well right now. And Donald Trump is inside, and he's probably going through the process of being arraigned as we're speaking right now. But this audience is showing no signs of abating, no signs of letting up. In fact, Charles, Donald Trump, the way he can hold the attention of his supporters, detractors, and of course the media, it's similar to what you see with a massive celebrity. When Donald Trump came in, the courthouse, while it's right behind me, but you saw the entire press, the entire audience of people fixated on just getting a look of Donald Trump going inside. And the entire space, Charles, it just quieted down. Everything just went silent as Donald Trump came up, his vehicle's parked, and he went inside. And that just shows you just the hold that he has on this entire nation and how this nation is fixated on Donald Trump as the former president. And Charles, I'll just say this very quickly. There is a current president, the current occupant of the White House in the United States right now. Well, he is an afterthought because right now, all of the attention, all of the focus is on the former president, Donald Trump.
And that's a very good point you make. I'm glad you pointed that out, because that gives us a sense of the man and his capacity to, if you like, bewitch the American people. And it is thought, Eric, that there will be more than 24 charges on the arraignment sheet. Some people talked about up to 30. What are you hearing about that? I wonder if you can outline for us where all this stems from.
Well, Charles, that would be a guess that we would take because the judge refused to actually provide us with a copy of the unsealed indictment before the arraignment took place. And typically that is what would happen, but that didn't happen in this case. So we didn't get it prior to it happening. So we still don't know what these charges are. We don't know if these are felonies or if these are misdemeanors that Donald Trump is facing. And depending on which they are, will certainly shape the tone, the tenor of this case, but more importantly, of Donald Trump as a defendant and also Donald Trump's continued candidacy for the Republican nomination for president of the United States.
And Erica, I know you're not, I mean, we're looking at pictures there of the courthouse. It's heavily guarded by police, live pictures. We know you're not inside the court and reporters are not allowed in there. But what are you hearing about the possibility that the judge might impose a gag order on Donald Trump to prevent him from going out to talk about the case or to talk at all to his base?
Yeah, that's a good question because we're told that the judge, and judges typically don't like implementing gag orders, and it's unclear if the judge will do that in this case, but we do know that Donald Trump has gone directly after the district attorney as well as the judge himself. So it's quite possible that could happen. But I suspect that Donald Trump, at least during this arraignment, will be very contrite. And it only will be tonight when we will see Donald Trump unplug when he does his press availability back at his Florida estate, where he will talk in greater detail about this. And we suspect that he will then, of course, go on the offensive once again on the judge as well as the district attorney in this case.
And Eric, just tell us what happens next, because we know he's in the courthouse at the moment. Kind of walk us through the sequence of events. I mean, he's being arraigned. He's read his Miranda rights, from what I understand. I don't know if mugshots were taken, whether he was fingerprinted. He's before a judge, and then he comes out, and what happens from there? Just kind of wrap it all up for us.
Yeah, this process is actually going to move very quickly. In fact, the entire process will take probably less than a couple of hours. And we know for a fact that he will be fingerprinted. It's unclear, Charles, if he's actually going to have a mugshot taken of him. We're told that he wasn't and that his lawyers actually protested having a mugshot taken. And then, of course, we know all 34 of these charges will be read against him. If, in fact, there are 34 charges, we know that they will be read against him. And then he will enter a plea after that there will begin the pre-trial motion in terms of dates that will be set, when the next hearing will take place, when he will have to return to court. And it's unclear if they're going to set a date for trial today. But we do know either today or someday in the very near future, Donald Trump's lawyers are going to ask to have this entire case thrown out. Now, it's unlikely that will happen as well, but we do know that is expected and that is forthcoming from Donald Trump's lawyers.
And of course, Eric, where you are, I mean, we saw, as you pointed out at the outset of our chat, we saw lots of people behind you there. And I am expecting that there are lots of ordinary Americans who both oppose and support Donald Trump. I wonder if you might give us a summary of their positions.
Yeah, right. Because right over here is where all of the media is, right here. And of course, you got a lot of spectators on another side. But inside this park, directly across from the courthouse, is where all of the demonstrations and colorful activity is taking place. And it's about half and half. In fact, they have the park literally cordoned off. So one half is for Trump supporters and the other half is for Trump detractors. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of vulgarities and there's a lot of spirited back and forth between both sides. Now, it's been largely peaceful, and it's almost as if it's a soccer match, if you will, that's being played out in terms of how the activity is. It's very spirited. People are engaged. People are going back and forth. But also, Charles, what people are also doing is they're literally talking to each other about the potential charges against Donald Trump as well.
Yes, and we're looking again at shots of police ringing the entrance to that courthouse, Eric. And I wonder if you might talk to us about concerns about possible violence there.
Yeah, well, Charles, we got here probably around 10:30 this morning. It's now maybe after 2 o'clock. So we've been here for almost 4 hours. And Charles, I got to tell you, it's heavily policed. There are police officers. You literally cannot throw a rock without hitting a police officer here. In addition to that, it's just a very peaceful situation that's playing out. I mean, people, like I said, people are very colorful. People are making their political ideologies and their feelings known about which side of the aisle they sit on. But there's no hint, no evidence of actual violence at all taking place here. In fact, it's just a demonstration. People have signs that they have up. People are making it known how they feel, but there's no threat. There's no sense of danger. There's no element of danger in the air. It's very peaceful because, again, this is not only this is where the courthouses are located, but One Police Plaza, which is the headquarters for the New York Police Department, is also just 2 blocks away from where we are. So this is a heavily policed area. And then again, you've got the police helicopters flying directly above us as well. So it's a very safe space right now. It also happens to be a very gorgeous day. And so I think people are also taking advantage of that also.
And Eric, just again, we're looking at live pictures of the police inside the courtroom, actually. I think they're guarding a side entrance, and I'm presuming that that's possibly the exit via which Mr. Trump will leave the building. But we're told that the New York Police Department has been working with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies and are saying that they've been reviewing things, and at this point they haven't seen any credible, serious threats of any kind, and that supports the point that you're making. But just on this very historic day, Eric, we've got about a minute and a half or so left. Just summarize what the day has been like for us.
Well, Charles, I think this is a day that was spectacle for Americans, but also for the world, because this is something that we've never seen. In fact, you could see it just in the curiosity, not only of the spectators that are here, but also of the press as well. But we also have to remember that when Donald Trump comes out of this building, he will be a billionaire. He will be a reality television star. He will be a former U.S. president. He will be many, many things, but also included in that, he will be a criminal defendant. And Charles, we all saw what took place on January 6th, and there was growing concern that what took place on January 6th could actually happen, or would it take place here today? And there hasn't even been remotely an instance of that happening. But what is still fragile about this situation is that Donald Trump is on a full frontal assault of the rule of law. And it is that rule of law that is the key pillar of democracy. And what's so ironic and compelling about Donald Trump as a presidential candidate, as a president, he has to uphold that oath, to uphold those laws that undergird this country. And right now, he's fighting to tear those very laws down.
Eric, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely sterling coverage there from you. Eric Ham, Arise US correspondent, talking to me there from outside the Lower Manhattan courthouse where Donald Trump is being arraigned. And of course, still with me for more analysis and keeping his eye on things that have been happening there in New York, Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic. Karl, just as we try to wrap up what's been happening in America today, I still find it quite amazing that, and almost bizarre, that all this might actually help him rather than hurt him politically.
Well, yes, Charles, but it does not take away from the fact that no matter how you cut it, this is a very dark day for Donald Trump. Here's Donald Trump, living in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, returning to New York, his childhood home, where he flourished as a businessman, was a celebrity in all the papers, and now instead he's being delivered to New York courtroom. That is a real dark day for Donald Trump. And how he turns that into political goldmine is anyone's guess. So Charles, and you rightly say, yes, still, this is an opportunity for him. For example, it depends on whether or not there's a gag order installed, and yet that's more complicated than it really is, because he's going to be given numerous warnings, but he's not going to be prevented from exercising his First Amendment rights. We will see him at a rally this evening, and I'm sure there will be pleas for more help, for donations. So yes, that will happen. And the problem is Republicans are nervous because he's got that base that is in lockstep with him. They already know the character of Donald Trump, and that's the most significant portion of the Republican base. About at least 25 to 30% of hardcore Republican MAGA-type conservatives, and they cannot break that away from him. But the thing to keep in mind, though, is this, Charles. For the first time, Donald Trump, he's not really in control of his situation. As Michael Cohen, the key witness who will appear in this trial, says that Donald Trump likes to control things. He's always in control of things, even when it comes to, shall we say, a media circus. But this time, he has to, run by the dictates of this judge, by the legal system. And then to put things in further context, Charles, once those charges are unsealed, Charles, what happens next is that you then have to have all of these deadlines for filing legal arguments for each charge. That's time consuming. And then you've got to consider the fact that you've got the evidence that the prosecution is sharing with the defense. That will take some time to go through, Charles. That's time consuming. And now you've got a legal team that's still playing musical chairs. Only hours before this trial arraignment began, Charles, he shuffled chairs again and has appointed a new lead attorney, Charles, in all of this. And to put things in further perspective, Charles, is this. This is one of many investigations. This is only the first to go to trial. So what happens to the other two or three? The one in Georgia, the one in Washington regarding January 6th, and the one returning regarding the handling of classical documents in Mar-a-Lago. All of those are separate investigations, will require multiple fronts. How much is this going to take away from his ability to even run and operate as a political candidate when the campaign has not even begun yet, Charles? That's why I was saying earlier, unofficially, this is the starting gun. This is the first day of the unofficial campaign for 2024.
Yes, it's very interesting indeed, and a man who is clearly under a storm of legal cases. But even beyond those other cases that you were talking about, looking specifically at what we know so far about this one, Karl, clearly it's not a good thing that hush money was paid, although he denies an affair, but there is clearly something that needs to be investigated here. And I mean, shooting straight, it certainly isn't a great look for a former US president. But is there also, Karl, a problem here for the Democrats? Because I was discussing this with Eric, I think yesterday or so. Bill Clinton, who was a former Democratic president, managed to change politics and the sex scandal in America. I mean, because it used to be that if you were involved in a sex scandal, you were done and dusted. But Mr. Clinton survived a sex scandal, didn't he? So why won't Donald Trump?
Well, again, Charles, I was also just, speaking about this a short while ago. Americans are not as maybe concerned about a candidate and a sex scandal. In other words, this is not the most serious case, if you will, Charles. What happens when we get maybe charges filed in the Georgia case where he was, instructing or asking officials in Georgia to, quote, find those 11,000 votes that could overturn the statewide results in his favor, or his role in the January 6th attack that led to the storming of the Capitol. Those, in the minds of many people, are like much, much more serious. That involves an attack, an assault on democracy in America. And we just don't know what the outcome of that would be because it's never happened before, Charles. And so, to be truthful, as I said, this is really not the most serious case, not even the most compelling, but it's the first case, and as the first case, that's why it's an historical first, and that's why you've got all this attention. But again, there are many more of these cases that will unfold where you'll see repeat of these circuses. So this is really not even the first act, Charles. It's maybe the first scene of the first act.
On that note, I want to thank you exceedingly, Karl Bostic, our special correspondent who's been monitoring developments there for us. He's been keeping an eye on things in New York there, the Lower Manhattan courthouse.